Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. I'm Jeff, joining me is my co-host Ness. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Ness and I have really enjoyed putting the show together each week. Thanks for listening. Well, a couple weeks ago we promised to explore some evergreen topics, and this week we're making good on that promise. We're talking about religion, specifically Christianity. Doesn't get much more perennial than that. I'm using this episode as an excuse to throw out various ideas and topics I've been kicking around for years. I do have specific areas to discuss, but this episode structure is going to be pretty loose. Ness and I both read an essay by Arthur Schopenhauer called On Religion, which we'll use as a springboard. I'll also be pulling from Timothy Keller, I've read 2 of his books. Thomas Jefferson and Dostoevsky may also make cameo appearances. We'll discuss the role we see religion, particularly Christianity, playing in our personal lives. We'll also opine on the role we think Christianity has/should play in contemporary American society and politics. And we'll also touch on Christian nationalism and whether Christianity is compatible with or contradicts Darwinism, evolution, and human biodiversity. We also want to discuss Judaism at some point, specifically the terms Judeo-Christian and the Jewish question, but we may have to save those topics for another episode. We'll see. Pretty ambitious agenda, so without further ado, let's get into it. So the first thing I want to talk about is truth. Is truth inherently valuable? Is it something that's important in and of itself, or is it merely a tool? Is it a means to an end? So in the context of Christianity, does it matter whether the specific assertions of Christianity, for example, the virgin birth of Jesus, the miracles, the resurrection, Jesus' ascension into heaven, does it matter whether those things are true, or is that beside the point? What do you think, Ness?
From a strictly materialist, non-spiritual perspective, then no, truth doesn't matter. It's incidental at most, but in the natural world, in the animal kingdom, truth is of, again, incidental value. Deception is common. There's no sense of fair play. There is only nature raw and tooth and claw.
But what I'm getting at is, when we're talking about Christianity, is it worth spending a lot of time on debating or trying to ascertain whether the specific supernatural claims made in the Bible, such as the miracles, such as the resurrection, is that an important thing to think about?
From the perspective of a believing Christian, from the perspective of someone who is materialist, from the perspective of someone who's agnostic.
Let's say someone who's agnostic, who's considering, maybe was raised in Christianity and took it for granted growing up, and now they're getting older, they're starting to think about things a little bit more critically, they're reading things, and they're determining whether, should I believe in Christianity, should I explore other religions, and they're thinking, well, at least I can speak for myself. When I've been evaluating Christianity, I look at, well, you believe this, and I've actually spoken to pastors who have explained, most of the pastors I've spoken to explain it like this. Christianity makes very specific claims, and they believe that those are true, and because those are true claims, that's why you should be a Christian. That's why it makes sense to be a Christian.
So do they argue that those claims are empirically validated, or do they take those claims on faith as having occurred in the way that they were recorded to have occurred?
Well, I have something, a quote on that. This is from Timothy Keller's book, Making Sense of God. He says, as long as you do not begin with an imposed philosophical bias against the possibility of miracles, the resurrection has as much attestation as any other ancient historical event. And the canonical Gospels were written at the very most 40 to 60 years after Jesus' death. So I think what those quotes are getting at, if you believe Tacitus's accounts or any of the ancient Herodotus's accounts of historical events, those have as much validity or weight as the things described in the Gospels in terms of whether the documents were valid, where they were written actually closer to the described events than a lot of other things that accounts that we take for granted, more or less. So yes, I think there are claims that these things actually happened, and that there's rational historical basis for believing those things.
Yeah, that perspective, historians argue constantly about the veracity of historical accounts. I mean, generally speaking, Tacitus and Herodotus are both considered generally more reliable accounts, whereas something like Cassius Dio is considered less so. But the bigger question is what angle you're coming at this from. If you're coming at it from a strictly empirical perspective, then I think you run into the invariable problem that you're trying to use natural faculties to evaluate supernatural events, and almost by definition you can't. And I think that's where a lot of Christian thinkers, theologians come to that conclusion one way or another with their emphasis on faith.
So my understanding of the Gospels, they are written in a way that's almost like a modern day journalist would write in terms of what a journalist should be anyway, recording events as they happened, just the facts, just what their observations were, or firsthand speaking to people who observed these events firsthand. So the question is, are those true? Was somebody lying about this? What are we to make of? Let me rephrase. Ness, I'm going to put you on the spot. When you hear about those accounts, do you think those accounts are true?
In an empirical sense?
In an empirical sense.
My guess would be probably not. It's to what degree are they true or not? For example, if was his body removed from a tomb, was it even placed in a tomb at all? I don't know. I don't have a strong sense. So I'm an agnostic about historical events generally, including ones that are imbued with presumed supernatural meaning.
But I do think that, at least, again, I can only speak with the religious leaders I've spoken to, and the consensus I've gotten from them is that they would say in an empirical, concrete sense, these things happened as they were recorded, but you do not think they did, as far the best you can tell.
How would they say that they would base that on faith, though? Not that they could empirically replicate these things happening.
I think at least the perspective I get is they believe it like they would believe Caesar's account of the Gallic Wars, or whatever historians' accounts of things. They would believe it in that same way, in the same sort of, that same way.
So why do they unconditionally believe the Gospels? Do they unconditionally believe Tacitus and Pliny the Younger as well? Do they believe without qualification historical accounts from other sources that they deem reliable? Why do they deem the Gospels especially reliable? I don't think there's an empirical reason for that.
Okay, so you think that's where the faith comes in?
Yes. Anecdotal sampling of religious leaders doesn't necessarily reflect the general belief of the faithful. A Gallup survey in 2022 found that 49% of Americans take the Bible to be primarily metaphorical. Only 20%, so 1 in 5, take it literally, and 24%, so about a quarter, think that it's effectively a book of fables. It's mythological. So a plurality, really a majority, a solid majority of self-described Christians look at the Bible and its teachings primarily through a metaphorical rather than a literal lens.
I'm going to quote some lines from Schopenhauer's essay on religion on this topic. So, Christianity is an allegory reflecting a true idea, but the allegory itself is not what is true. Another quote, "The weak point of all religions remains that they can never dare to confess to being allegorical, so that they have to present their doctrines in all seriousness as true, which leads to perpetual deception." Another quote, "The plain, unvarnished, literal truth is striven for only in philosophy."
But not modern philosophy.
Yeah. "In the eyes of the friend of truth, every fraud, however pious, is still a fraud. Lastly, Religion is truth expressed in allegory and myth, and thus made accessible and digestible to mankind at large.
I'm not an expert on Schopenhauer, but I would. There's an epistemological question here. When the assertion is made that something's true or not, what do we mean by that? Again, is it an empirical, literal sense that something occurred or something didn't occur?
I think so. That's how I take it.
Well, in that case, then metaphor and allegory is definitionally untrue, but so is all language. All language is untrue because language doesn't have any empirical, it symbolizes representations of empirical reality, but it is by definition just a non-empirical rendering of an empirical truth. So it gets confusing. Truth in these quotations, the idea of truth is assuming a lot and probably assuming different things to different people. And so it's hard for me to even react to those assertions without being able to define terms ahead of time.
So I think it's, I mean, maybe I'm not thinking about it correctly. Christianity makes specific claims, and again, that Jesus was born. All the stories in the Bible, in the Gospels, that he died on the cross. He rose 3 days later. He ascended into heaven. I think that's what Schopenhauer is getting at. Those very specific things, he's claiming that they didn't happen, that they are allegorical, and that they didn't literally happen, but they represent something. They represent greater moral truths.
Yes, I would concur with that. But from a Christian perspective, the answer to that idea that these are merely metaphors because these sorts of miracles can't happen is that the age of miracles is over, and that chapter in the story of humanity and the spiritual journey of humanity has progressed past that point. And so just because those miracles can't be replicated today, can't be empirically verified today, doesn't mean that at some point in the past that they were unable to have occurred.
I'm going to leave this topic with a quote from Thomas Jefferson. He said, quote, "The day will come when the mystical generation of Jesus, by the Supreme Being as his father in the womb of a virgin, will be classed with the fable of the generation of Minerva in the brain of Jupiter." I think that quote is getting at a similar idea of from Schopenhauer, that the allegory is just a way to communicate eternal truths essentially to people because that's the only way they can understand them. I took it as a condescending way of looking at things, that people can't understand or can't comprehend the truth if you just tell it to them straightforwardly. So they have to use allegory and myths and tell these morals in stories.
Well, what gets more attention today? Is it movies or novels, or is it like documentaries? Fiction sells a lot better than nonfiction. The human mind is wired for narrative, for story, for allegory, for metaphor, not just for literal dry readings of empirical occurrences. And it's a stretch to say that Greek mythology really imparts any sort of moral lessons at all. It's a sort of pre-modern morality that isn't really recognized in any philosophical sense. Christian morality is structured, it's rigid, there are precepts that follow from other precepts that it's impossible to characterize Greek mythology in the same way.
The next subtopic I have is Christianity without Christ. So what I'm getting at is, can you excise or remove the supernatural elements from Christianity? Speaking of Thomas Jefferson, like he did with his Bible. He famously crossed out all the supernatural elements of the Bible and just left in the moral teaching. So he said, quote, "There never was a more pure and sublime system of morality delivered to man than is to be found in the four evangelists." So the question is, can you take the Christianity as allegorical? Jesus was a person, just like he was a normal person, but he was a great moral teacher. I would argue you can't do that. Once you do that, it's not Christianity. It's just any other philosophical system. It's just whether it's Stoicism, Epicureanism, whatever, Buddhism. It's just one of other philosophical systems. That's my take on it. What do you think, Ness?
I think that's giving it way too much credit. I think it would have to be dismissed immediately. To channel C.S. Lewis, this is what he called the trilemma issue with the idea of Jesus as a moral teacher, because if he's a moral teacher, given the other assertions that he made, he must be either, there are really three options, hence the term trilemma, that either Jesus was telling the truth, Jesus was lying intentionally and was one of the greatest charlatans of all time, or Jesus was a lunatic. And so if Jesus wasn't telling the truth, or if it is just a non-supernatural philosophical system, then by definition Jesus wasn't telling the truth. And so it's hard to argue that a liar or a lunatic could be providing a moral system that is the most sublime in human history.
So I think we're getting back to what we were talking about before. Doesn't it just all hinge on, or Christianity, the validity of, or whether we should pay attention to it at all? Doesn't it all hinge upon, were the things that Jesus said true? Did they happen? Did the miracles happen? Was he crucified? Did he die, and was he resurrected 3 days later? Isn't that what we're getting back to? And that, if I understand you correctly, you're saying that's the only reason, only if those things are true, if the things he said are true and the accounts of him are true, does Christianity have validity.
So I'll turn it around on you. What would you have to see today to believe the historical accounts of miracles? Or are you not coming in already dismissing out of hand that they're possible at all because they aren't replicable in current standards at current day?
That's a great point. I think the only way I would have to see it in modern day. I think I would have to see it replicated in some way. I think I would have to see something supernatural occur in the modern day. I think that's the only way.
Yeah, well, at the risk of sounding overly reductionist, take it back to my 2-sentence synopsis of the entire issue, which is that if you're trying to evaluate supernatural claims using natural faculties, you're creating a category error. You're not going to be able to see that. Can you explain what the evidence would look like for you to believe in the historical accounts of the Gospels? Can you?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, so by definition, you're never going to be able to. We're wasting our time trying to potentially find accounts of these things because by definition, even hypothetically, you can't come up with what it would look like. Mm-hmm. And so if you can't even come up with what it would hypothetically look like, you're certainly not going to find something that represents what it is that you would need to find to have a sort of certainty that the historical accounts, including the miracles and the supernatural elements, actually occurred.
Mm-hmm. How do you deal with the fact that you don't believe that these miracles happen? That you believe essentially the accounts in the Gospels are false. They didn't happen. They're myth. They're false. Does that affect how you live your life on day to day? Is there a sense of regret? Because I guess how I feel about it, I feel like I think my life would be better if I did have that faith. I don't think I'm ever going to have it. I think I've really tried earnestly, and I don't think I'll ever have it. And it sounds like you're in a similar boat. You can correct me if I'm wrong. How does that affect how you live your life?
Well, there are probably ascetic monks who have spent decades completely devoid of human contact, living in the desert on the sparsest means, who would take issue with your assertion that you've made a really full,
fair enough,
good effort, good faith attempt. But I wouldn't quite categorize myself as definitively disbelieving that these things happened in the past. know that I don't have any methodological approach that would allow me to empirically verify that they did. So if I had that sort of revelation made to me, then I would be happy to accept it. But as we were talking about earlier, I don't even know hypothetically how that would happen beyond some miracle happening contemporaneously. But if the age of miracles is closed, it's something that is not possible to be actively disproven, but the story does make sense if you grant, within its own bounded rationality, if you grant that in the past we were in an age of miracles, and now that revelation has been made and the promises have been filled, et cetera, there's no longer a need for miracles, and the age of miracles have closed.
So the commandments made in the Bible, where does your system of morality come from? When you certainly think some things are, I use the word evil, you think certain things are right, certain things are wrong. If you don't believe in Christianity, or where do you get that sense of right and wrong? Is it more just a gut instinctual thing that you have, your system of morality, or do you think it is a product of your Christian upbringing? What do you think?
I think it's a confluence of factors. I think it's genetic, it's cultural, it may be spiritual. Additionally, I try not to close myself off from the idea that I may be having information. So inside of my mind, I am the only person who can get there. Myself and potentially God, potentially some supernatural being, but that's not something I can share with anyone else. I can try to manifest a shadow of what's going on inside of my head using language and using nonverbal communication with other humans, but I don't, their sense of, their frame of mind is not going to be the same as my frame of mind, let alone their inability to directly access my thoughts. And so that seems like that gourd between the ears is closed off to everyone but myself, but it's not impossible for me to imagine that is my connection to something that is more divine, because that's where it is just myself and the divine potentially interacting in a way that is not completely clear to me as a natural being. But that might be a grandiose way of kind of avoiding the reality that my morality is primarily informed now as a father of multiple children from a very biological perspective, a biological imperative, that my morality is really to live in a way that creates a legacy and protects my offspring. And the tenets of the conventional morality that I profess are not in modern circumstances put to the test to any significant degree. What I might claim to be a moral precept could go out the window pretty quickly, I could imagine, if the proverbial poop hits the fan and I am deciding between my children or my neighbor's children.
Right. So I guess, is it fair to say that you, because I have heard this very, very often, that I remember distinctly, I heard a sermon at a church I attended, and he laid out his hierarchy, and he very clearly put God above his family and his children. It was God, family, country. So you would certainly not do that. You wouldn't put any commandments or Christian, morality above your own children. For instance, like Abraham killing Isaac. You would never do anything like that. Your children are your ultimate above everything else. Is that fair to say?
I think probably. I can't say definitively because I haven't had that put to the test. Now, maybe if I had some sort of clear divine revelation that instructed me to do otherwise, if some supernatural event happened, like an angel materialized out of the sky and told me to do these things, if I was convinced that I wasn't mentally delusional, then that might change the calculus. But given my natural faculties now, the assertion by someone else who has natural faculties that there is some supernatural imperative for me to do something that's biologically disastrous is not going to be compelling in any scenario that I can run through in my head. It's worth noting, too, that you're referencing the Ten Commandments. Half of those Ten Commandments are moral precepts that are shared universally. They're the first set of the commandments have to do with a monotheistic God, and that is something that was at the time a novelty to the Levant, to the Hebrew roots that Christianity grew out of. But the rest of the commandments about honoring the mother and father and not stealing and not murdering, those are moral precepts that, again, exist in almost every moral system that we're aware of.
There's a quote from Thomas Keller's Making Sense of God. Quote, "Modern people say they do not believe in absolute moral values, but can't function without practically assuming them."
Can you expound on that quote? I'm not familiar with Thomas Keller. That reads to me like an assertion. I don't know that most people would self-describe as moral relativists. Sorry, Timothy Keller. But I think most people would still see or receive a phrase like moral relativism as a pejorative, not something that most people would stand on.
I think the context is that there's a lot of people, either agnostic or atheist, look at dismiss Christianity and say Christianity is just another belief system. It's no better, it's no worse than any other Buddhism or philosophical system or Islam or Hinduism. But I think they don't live their lives that way. They are very offended by certain things, by certain behaviors, and they have very clear, unambiguous opinions on what's right and what's wrong.
Well, yeah, if you're talking about atheists and agnostics, there are many precepts that they treat as absolute truths. I mean, just think of the ideas of like systemic oppression and white supremacy and this belief in hierarchy of, intersectionality, all of these things that have a strong religious angle to them. They're assertions, they're not empirically verifiable, and when they are put to the empirical test, they collapse immediately. I mean, they just miss all kinds of obvious biological, which we talk about human biodiversity, obvious biological underpinnings to presume that outcomes are completely independent of biology. From the General Social Survey from over the last 10 years, atheists and agnostics, 50% are leftist politically compared to the broader American population, where less than 25% self-describe as liberal or very liberal. And among theists, it's about 20% of the population. So there are a lot of leftist beliefs that take issue with basic questions of biology, like, for example, to use one that's familiar to just about everybody, the question of what is a woman, the absurd anti-biological answers that a lot of these self-proclaimed atheists and agnostics will provide to a question like that is informed by a woke intersectional faith that has no empirical bearing whatsoever.
And I think that gets back to something that philosophy has been grappling with for centuries, at least since Nietzsche. God is dead, so what's next? And I think there's a quote from Brothers Karamazov that stood out to me that summarized the danger of killing God, so to speak. Quote, "For those who renounce Christianity and rebel against it are in their essence of the same image of the same Christ, and such they remain. For until now, neither their wisdom nor the ardor of their hearts has been able to create another, higher image of man and his dignity than the image shown of old by Christ. And whatever their attempts, the results have been only monstrosities." I think that's true today. As we were discussing, I think it's a fair argument to have evaluating Christianity. Is it true or not? And if you say, no, it's not true, then there should be something to replace it. And I think it's very clear there is not anything that can replace it. So it's a very dangerous thing to knock down Christianity, to kill God, so to speak.
Well, the transhumanists would disagree. They think that transhumanist project, uploading your consciousness into the cloud, removing it from the meat stick, so to speak, is the next step in the death of God and the replacement of, well, the death of God, or the subsuming of human consciousness to become what God was perceived to be historically. I'm not optimistic about that potential, but it would be remiss not to mention that, because there are very many high IQ autistic types who believe that is indeed the future.
In the alt-right sphere, I think it's fair to say you hear a lot of denigration of Christianity. The ideas put forth that Roman paganism or whatever preceded Christianity in Europe was superior to what came. And this quote, this idea is touched on from this quote from Timothy Keller's book, The Reason for God. Quote, Christianity changed those honor-based cultures in which pride was valued rather than humility, dominance rather than service, courage rather than peaceableness, glory rather than modesty, loyalty to one's own tribe rather than equal respect for all. What do you think, Ness?
I think Christianity did move those societies in that direction syncretically, in a sort of Hegelian sense, but it's a gross oversimplification to assume that those values were completely swapped out as opposed to just being moderated. So from Constantine conquering in this sign in the 4th century, to Urban II launching a war of reconquest in the 12th century, to Franco putting commies 6 feet under in the 20th century, all of these things have been done with Christianity as the force behind and the justification for the martial spirit that these movements and so many others like them were fueled by. And now the extent today that there is any sort of Western rearguard action to save the virtues that were putatively replaced, or that were replaced by, or at least tempered by Christianity, it's Christians today in opposition to non-Christian forces that are far more antithetical to the concept of honor or pride or dominance or courage or glory or any of these other ancient virtues that were allegedly replaced by Christianity. If I'm making a polemical case from the Christian perspective, I would say that these virtues were not replaced, they were tempered, because when a virtue like honor is held up at the exclusion of all other virtues, you end up with situations where some man dishonors himself as a warrior by forgetting to sheath his sword correctly and ends up having to commit suicide, not just himself, but his entire family. His servants have to die with him. There's a lot of deadweight loss that comes with this emphasis to the exclusion of all else on the virtues that were replaced by Christianity, and that focus, that undue focus on those virtues at the exclusion of other things like cooperation and magnanimity and social cohesion and these other sorts of things, are a primary reason why Christianity was able to subdue the pagans. I mean, the Christians, Constantine, in this sign you will conquer, the Christians were better warriors than the warrior cultures that they conquered. Jesus really did come bearing a sword, and he used that sword to lop Odin's head off and to destroy to just totally ravage everything at Mount Olympus and all of the other polytheistic deities that were spread far and wide across Europe and the Near East and sub-Saharan Africa, and really just had its way with the world until Islam was born in the 7th century to give Christianity a run for its money.
All right, the next topic is Darwinism, race realism, human biodiversity. Are those things compatible with Christianity? So I have a quote to get us started again. This is from Christianity's Dangerous Idea. Quote, Darwin's theory suggested that no fundamental biological distinction can be drawn between human beings and animals in terms of their origin and development. And from Schopenhauer, on religion. Quote, "The animal is in essence absolutely the same thing that we are, and that the difference lies merely in the accident, the intellect, and not in the substance, which is the will." Finally, from Schopenhauer, quote, "A fundamental error of Christianity is that it has, in an unnatural fashion, sundered mankind from the animal world to which it essentially belongs, and now considers mankind alone as of any account."
Well, a strong argument against those assertions is that it is only man that can understand anything that was said there. That there is a clear break, that there is no other biological entity outside of mankind that can make sense of any of what was just said there.
So I take it you don't see any contradiction between believing in human biodiversity, believing in Darwinism and evolution, and Christianity?
No, not at all.
Do you think it's neutral, or do you think Christianity actually supports these theories?
Well, Christianity tracks various nations, and the nations have different tendencies, and the populations are described as doing different things. The underlying presumption seems to be that humans are not interchangeable cogs in a machine, and that the Canaanites are different than the Israelites, and presumably then the Africans are different than the Europeans, and the Europeans are different than the Asiatics, that are different than the Amerindians, et cetera, et cetera.
So that's human biodiversity. Let's split it up to evolution. Why do you think there was such resistance? I would say primarily from a religious perspective. Why was there such hostility to the theory of evolution? I'm thinking in a basic sense, the Garden of Eden, the creation story, that God created humanity out of dust. It was, there was nothing, and then there was humanity. It's certainly, to me, it's completely incompatible with the idea of apes slowly developing into humans, into black Africans, and then Africans leaving Africa and evolving into Europeans and other races. To me, it seems like evolution and the creation story are completely at odds. What do you think, Ness?
Well, evolution is really at odds with human hardware, human understanding of the world, because there's virtually no one. I mean, the people who are there are on the dissident right, that small, totally ostracized persona non grata segment of the population that takes the idea of evolution to its natural conclusion. Virtually no one who claims to be an atheist or agnostic will actually take evolution. We even know the full title of Darwin's most famous work, which is the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Or in his subsequent work, The Descent of Man, where he talks about how different racial groups among humans have differences in brain capacity, and the idea that the most complex, energy-intensive organ in the human body was somehow totally exempt from natural selection, evolutionary processes. And yet, though that so clearly follows from the basic precepts of the theory of evolution, almost no one alive will publicly assert as much. So I don't think it's something that's specific to Christians. I think it's something that is specific to all humans. I don't think we have the hardware, evolutionarily speaking, because it's not. We can get into how those who have this monomaniacal desire to find the truth and believe in evolution, to taking it all the way to its logical conclusion, tend to be the least evolutionarily fit. And so it seems that there is some issue with these belief systems, and having the capacity for those belief systems leads to those who have those capacities being bred out of the population. And so consequently, we're left with the human population that simply is not equipped to understand the idea of evolution in a scientific sense, which kind of gets back to what we were talking about at the beginning, when we mentioned how humans like stories and how they like narratives, and that is how the human mind is set up.
This week we are putting our motto of "No topic is off limits" to the test. I agree with everything you said there. It's just crazy to me how people can talk about. It's usually leftists, it's atheists, agnostics. They'll talk about evolution. They'll talk about how that explains how humanity came about. But as soon as you talk about, well, wouldn't evolution, if it changed our skin color, if it changed our height, or changed our eye color, our hair, they'll acknowledge that because you can't deny it. But then you say, well, wouldn't it have affected people's brains too? And then that's when they get real uncomfortable and they'll just deny it. And like Ness said, it's just absurd to think that evolution or biology would act on all these other characteristics, but it wouldn't touch the brain. It would lead. The brain is just completely the same. It hasn't evolved. It hasn't changed. It's absurd.
Yeah, the idea that there would be natural selection acting upon hair thickness, which doesn't matter or matters very little in terms of survival, but wouldn't act on time preference or language capacity or visuospatial reckoning or all of these other things that are very clearly and obviously tied to differential survival rates in different climates is absurd.
And so you don't think there's any contradiction between two groups of people being different, distinct. There's no contradiction between that idea and Christianity. So do you think there is any conflict between Christianity and the theory of evolution as Darwin lays it out?
No. Again, I'm an agnostic, so I'm probably not the right person to ask that question to, but I don't see a contradiction. I can see how they can easily be reconciled. So
Ness, I think your idea is agreed with by this quote from Christianity's Dangerous Idea. Quote, in an 1888 essay on Darwin, Benjamin B. Warfield set out his view that the Darwinian doctrine of natural selection could easily be accommodated by evangelicals as a natural law operating under the aegis of the general providence of God. So that sounds like intelligent design, the theory that God had evolution in mind and he planned it out. But I have trouble with that, just reconciling that idea with the accounts in Genesis. What do you think?
I'm going to rehash what I already said. If you take a metaphorical approach, then that's not a problem at all. If you're assuming that these things are literal and that the timeline is literal as well, then yeah, you're going to have issues. But I don't think that describes a majority of Christians today.
So a Bible quote that equalists bring up a lot, and I think usually this is brought up by people hostile to Christianity. It's Galatians 3:28. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus.
Well, that's taking the idea of autonomy and applying a spiritual filter to it. That clearly that is not meant to be read as a description of a physical, biological reality. We have the story of the Philistines and David fighting against the Philistines, and the Philistines are described as a giant race. They tower over the Hebrews, so right there you have biological differences. But in a spiritual sense, salvation is accessible to all through Jesus Christ, and that's clearly the purpose of that Galatians chapter.
We're about to wrap up. One last question I want to ask. So about Donald Trump. He has tremendous support among evangelical Christians. And you would think on the surface that this seems contradictory. He is someone who's been married 3 times. Anytime he speaks about Christianity, the Bible, it's very clear he has a very superficial understanding of Christianity. And if he's ever read the Bible, it was very cursory. He's been married 3 times. He was cheating on his current wife with a porn star while his wife was pregnant. Despite all this, he has very strong support among evangelical Christians. How do you explain that, Ness? What do you think the explanation is for that?
Interest over principles. I think if your idea is that Well, are these evangelical voters looking for a spiritual exemplar, a paragon of virtue? No, they're not. They're looking for a political leader who will take the fight to their enemies and protect their interests. And Donald Trump, being a cultural Christian who has the same general moral instincts and is not going to necessarily defend the things that he does, is some sort of example of moral rectitude. Whereas Biden might go to mass, but it's clear to evangelicals that he and his coalition hate them and think they're deplorable and wish that they would vanish, wish that they would just die or be replaced. So I think they're due more credit for having an intact survival instinct that they're exercising in their support for Trump.
All right, that concludes another episode of the Reality Taboo podcast. A bit different this week. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll be talking to you soon. Please remember, like, share, subscribe. We'll talk to you soon.
There's Wolves.